The Roman Empire was the most advanced civilization of the ancient world. It was the largest empire to have ruled anywhere in the world for over 800 years, until it came crashing down towards the 5th century AD. At its height, the empire stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the Northern Africa and Mesopotamia, making it one of the greatest powers in world history, often regarded as the founder of the modern military tactics. The phrase, "the fall of Rome," suggests that some cataclysmic event ended the Roman Empire, which stretched from the British Isles to Egypt and Iraq at its height. But in the end, there was no straining at the gates, no barbarian horde that dispatched the Roman Empire in one fell swoop. Instead, the Roman Empire fell slowly as a result of challenges from within and without, changing over the course of hundreds of years until its form was unrecognizable. Different historians have placed an end date at many different points on a continuum. Perhaps the fall of Rome is best understood as a compilation of various maladies that altered a large swath of human habitation over many hundreds of years. In today's episode of History Simplified, we take a look at the causes that led to the fall of the greatest and the most powerful empire of the world, and what political and social lessons we can take from this great historical event and apply to our modern socio-political structure of the world. In his masterwork, The Decline and the Fall of Roman Empire, historian Edward Gibbon selected 476 CE, a date most often mentioned by historians as the date when the Roman Empire fell. That date was when Odoacer, the Germanic king of the Torcellingi, deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Roman emperor to rule the western part of the Roman Empire. The eastern half became the Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. But the city of Rome continued to exist. Some see the rise of Christianity as putting an end to the Romans. Those who disagree with that see the rise of Islam a more fitting bookend to the end of the empire. But that would put the fall of Rome at Constantinople in 1453. In the end, the arrival of Odoacer was but one of the many barbarian incursions into the empire. Certainly, the people who lived through the takeover would probably be surprised by the importance we place on determining an exact event and time, but not so over the causes that led to these events. The most straightforward theory for Western Rome's collapse pins the fall on a string of military losses sustained against outside forces. The barbarians, which is a term that covers a varied and changing group of outsiders, were embraced by Rome, who used them as suppliers of tax revenue and bodies for the military, even promoting them to positions of power. But Rome also lost territory and revenue to them, especially in Northern Africa, which Rome lost to the Vandals at the time of Saint Augustine in the 5th century CE. Rome lost Spain to the Sueves, Alans and Visigoths. The loss of Spain meant Rome lost revenue along with the territory and administrative control. A perfect example of the interconnected causes leading to Rome's fall. The revenue was needed to support Rome's army, and Rome needed its army to keep what territory it has amassed. Rome had tangled with Germanic tribes for centuries, but by the 300s, barbarian groups like the Goths had encroached beyond the empire's borders. The Romans weathered a Germanic uprising in the late 4th century, but in 410 AD, the Visigoth king Alaric successfully sacked the city of Rome. The empire spent the next several decades under the constant threat before the Eternal City was raided again in 455. this time by the Vandals. Finally, in 476, the Germanic leader Odysseus staged a revolt and deposed the emperor Romulus Augustulus. From then on, no Roman emperor would ever again rule from a post in Italy, leading many to cite 476 AD as the year the Western Empire suffered its death blow. When the Roman Empire started, back in 4th century BC, there was no such religion as Christianity. In the 1st century CE, Herod executed the founder, Jesus, for treason. It took his followers a few centuries to gain enough clout to be able to win over imperial support. This began in the early 4th century with Emperor Constantine, who was actively involved in Christian policymaking. When Constantine established a state-level religious tolerance in the Roman Empire, he took on the title of Pontiff, although he was not necessarily a Christian himself, as he wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed. He gave Christians privileges and oversaw major Christian religious disputes. He may not have understood how the pagan cults, including those of the emperors, were at odds with the new monotheistic religion, but they were. And in time, the old Roman religions got lost. Over time, Christian church leaders became increasingly influential, eroding the emperor's powers. For example, when Bishop Ambrose threatened to withhold the sacraments, Emperor Theodosius did the penance the bishop assigned him. Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion in 390 AD. Since Roman civic and religious life were deeply connected, priestesses controlled the fortune of Rome. Prophetic books told leaders what they needed to do to win wars, and emperors were defied. Christian religion beliefs and allegiances conflicted with the working of the empire. Even as Rome was under attack from outside forces, it was crumbling from within thanks to severe financial crisis. Constant wars and overspending had significantly lightened imperial coffers, and oppressive taxation and inflation had widened the gap between the rich and the poor. In the hope of avoiding the taxman, many members of the wealthy classes had even fled to the countryside and set up independent fiefdoms. At the same time, the empire was rocked by a labor deficit. Rome's economy depended on slaves to till its field and work as craftsmen, and its military might had traditionally provided a fresh influx of conquered people to put to work. But when expansion grinded to a halt in the 2nd century, Rome's supply of slaves and other war treasures began to dry up as well. A further blow came in the 5th century when the Vandals claimed North Africa and began disrupting the empire's trade by prowling the Mediterranean as pirates. With its economy faltering and its commercial and agricultural production in decline, the empire began to lose its grip on Europe. There is no doubt that decay, the loss of Roman control over the military and populace, affected the ability of the Roman Empire to keep its borders intact. Early issues included the crisis of the Republic in the 1st century BCE, under the Emperors Sulla and Marius, as well as that of the Gracchi brothers in the 2nd century CE. But by the 4th century, the Roman Empire had simply become too big to control. The decay of the army, according to the 5th century Roman historian Vegetius, came from within the army itself. The army grew weak from a lack of wars and stopped wearing their protective gears. This made them vulnerable to enemy weapons and provided the temptation to flee from battlefield. Vegetius said the leaders became incompetent and rewards were unfairly distributed. In addition, as time went on, Roman citizens, including soldiers and their families living outside of Italy, identified with Rome less and less compared to their Italian counterparts. They preferred to live as natives, even if this meant poverty, which in turn meant they turned to those who could help: Germans, brigands, Christians, and Vandals. If Rome's sheer size made it difficult to govern, ineffective and inconsistent leadership only served to magnify that problem. Being the Roman emperor had always been a dangerous job, but during the tumultuous 2nd and the 3rd century, it nearly became a death sentence. Civil war thrust the empire into chaos, and more than 20 men took the throne in the span of only 75 years, usually after the murder of their predecessor. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, assassinated and installed new sovereigns at will, and once even auctioned the spot off to the highest bidder. The political wrath also extended to the Roman Senate, which failed to temper the excesses of the emperors due to its own widespread corruption and incompetence. As the situation worsened, civic pride waned, and many Roman citizens lost their trust in the leadership. The fate of Western Rome was partially sealed in the late 3rd century, when the Emperor Diocletian divided the empire into two halves: the Western Empire, seated in the city of Milan, and the Eastern Empire in Byzantium, later known as Constantinople. The division made the empire more easily governable in the short term, but over time the two halves drifted apart. East and West failed to adequately work together to combat outside threats, and the two often squabbled over resources and military aid. As the Gulf widened and largely Greek-speaking Eastern Empire grew in wealth, while the Latin-speaking West descended into economic crisis and chaos. Most importantly, the strength of the Eastern Empire served to divert barbarian invasions to the West. Emperors like Constantine ensured that the city of Constantinople was fortified and well guarded, but Italy and the city of Rome, which only had symbolic value for many in the East, were left vulnerable. The Western political structure would finally disintegrate in the 5th century, but the Eastern Empire endured in some form for another 1,000 years before being overwhelmed by the Ottoman Empire in the 1400s. Gibbon gives a classic formulation of reasons why the fall happened. He gave great weight to internal decline as well as to attacks from outside the empire. In his book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Gibbon states, "The story of its ruin is simple and obvious, and instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it had subsisted for so long. The victorious legions, who in distant wars acquired the vices of strangers and mercenaries, first oppressed the freedom of the republic and afterwards violated the majesty of the purple." The decline and the subsequent fall of the Roman Empire was a complex mix of cultural, political, and sociological changes sweeping across the continent of Europe. In fact, during the period of imperial decline, the empire actually expanded. That influx of conquered people and lands changed the structure of Roman government. Emperors moved the capital away from the city of Rome too. The schism of East and West created not just an Eastern capital first in Nicomedia and then Constantinople, but also move in the West from Rome to Milan. The fact that the Roman Empire, an enormous power of political and military might, the likes of which the world did not see before, could decline, fall, and get lost in the sands of time, tells us loads about the mere futility of the petty territorial conflicts that we find ourselves in today. Nothing, not even Rome, could escape the fatal bite of time, and all the factors mentioned above only acted as a catalyst to its downfall. Corruption, greed, misrule, and apathy towards the general population will always lead to one result and one result only: utter obliteration. The world changed a lot in the last 1600 years since Rome fell. but the termites that led to its downfall still plagues the world in the 21st century. I hope you found this video interesting. Do leave a like on this video if you think this is informative and subscribe to the History Simplified channel. Share this with your friends and family so that more and more people are made aware of our history and how that can affect socio-political scenario even today. Stay informed, stay curious, and I will see you on the next one.